specifically about my work and my research, but I will talk about the research of multiple of my colleagues over the last period. So, from an historical point of view, I need to move this one too because I need to move my notes. Now it didn't go. Okay. So, from an historical point of view, when we think of cultures of water, we think of three key elements. So water on one hand, land and people, and it's from the interaction and the exchanges between these three elements that you can see the development of cultures of water. And I think here there's a lot of commonality with other social sciences, but also even with hard sciences and environmental studies on the way we looked at it. If we zoom in on this, what is essential for us is this interconnection. So these key nodes and the exchanges between them. So there's three key elements when it comes to understanding the development of cultures of water, which is the relationship between the sea. Usually that's what is most studied in history of the ocean, but also it would apply to the river, so as a water surface. The relationship of this water element with the port and the relationship with the port of the hinterland, and how the port mediates the relationship between the hinterland and the river, the sea, or the ocean. And in this relationship, it's very important to, for us historians nowadays, to keep in mind that these three elements, they not only have exchanges between them, but they are both suppliers and consumers of different things. So goods on one hand, but also finished products, people, which of course also translate into labor, and also consumers and suppliers of ideas, of knowledge, and technology. And the sea, of course, here I don't have anything underneath the sea or the river or the ocean, but of course the sea is also a source of raw materials. It's a gateway for the circulation of these different elements. This is basically where we are in terms of conceptualization of how to think about water cultures or cultures of water. If we plot this into the Atlantic, and at the time that European expansion emerged, and at the time that the Colombian exchanges takes place in the early 16th century, we will have something like that. If it will work. Okay, here you go. So now we work. So what you have is the multiplication of that diagram, which I showed you previously, on, let's imagine, one side is Europe, the Mediterranean, and Africa. On the other side, you have the Americas. And what you have is the demultiplication of the same diagram, so those dynamics between the port and the hinterland and the sea, multiplied also on the other side. So this means that when we think of water cultures in history, at least from a historical perspective, we are talking of a shared or jointly constructed culture of water. So what happens in terms of development of culture of water here in Porto will also have implications on what happens, for example, in Brazil, where people from Porto were present. So water facilitates the transfer of knowledge, facilitates the transfer of technology, the transfer of infrastructure, and also facilitate, of course, the transfer. With this goes the transfer of people and the transfer of goods. And to give you a very simple example of that, this is two images. They look very much alike. It's an example of how you transfer in fact, architectural knowledge and infrastructure across the world. On one side you have Amsterdam, on the other side you have Curaçao. I could do the same for the Portuguese Empire. We could do the same with images of spaces that are in Spain or in Spanish America. You will have that, and this is, to a certain extent, shows the importance of these exchanges in the construction of common cultures of water. I could talk about other things, but I want to move on to my core task, which is to talk about labor. These same exchanges that will develop in the Atlantic world in the course of the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, and I will not go beyond that, because that's beyond the early modern period. They will also imply the circulation and the mobility of people. They will increase dramatically the circulation and the mobility of people. And we know today that this mobility involves different groups. So we have on one hand European immigrant workers. They were especially when from the UK and also from Northern and Western Europe to North America especially. But we also know that there was a significant number of enslaved Africans that crossed the Atlantic, and there is an increasing mobility of soldiers, army soldiers, but also Navy soldiers, and seamen and merchants that will operate in these routes. So now we get to leaving this conception aside. Now I will go to my main task, which is to see or reflect with you of how have historians examined this circulation of people and of labor, and how they have and how different subfields within history have contributed to this. And to what extent have the main chronological scope, the main spatial or geographical scope has changed, or the thematic, also the topic of examen has changed, and to what extent the methodology or the focus of analysis has changed. So if we think of history, so you have history as a main discipline, but then within history there's multiple subfields, and this is common for all disciplines, so there's nothing new here. But there's a number of subfields within history that have contributed more to improve our understanding of maritime labor history. And of course, there's some usual suspect or obvious suspects, which is maritime history and labor history. But then there's also other subfields like Atlantic history that emerged from transatlantic studies in during the Cold War, or even before the Cold War period. It's a more recent field of history. African history that emerged from area studies and from colonial studies in Europe, area studies in the United States. That will also have a contribution to better our understanding of maritime labor history. The same could be said about even more recent subfields like gender studies or slavery studies. So I will focus on a couple of them, so 4 of them, and the other ones I will not focus on, not because they are not important, but because I only have X number of time, and I will privilege those that I am most knowledgeable on. So let's start with labor history, since I come from the International Institute of Social History, and we are known as an institute that has a main focus in terms of research, gender and labor history. So labor history has suffered quite a bit of transformation over the last 8 years. And we can define that transformation there has been three key moments, and we usually divide them in these three different categories. So old labor history, new labor history, global labor history. I don't know how familiar you are with this terminology, but I will try to talk you through what's the difference between these and how this has changed the way we look at maritime labor. So let's talk first about traditional labor history. So as you can imagine, labor history emerged in the end of the 19th century with the rise of the working class and with industrialization. That is when issues of labor become extremely important. And it's from that period on that you will have a development of labor history. This labor history and the first labor history that will be carried out is a labor history that will very much focus on the wage earner, on the proletarialization of the working class, so the development of the working class, the proletarialization, the labor movements, the struggle of the trade unions to have better conditions. And of course, because it's very linked with the Industrial Revolution and working class formation, it is very much Eurocentric. And it's very much centered on males. So it's about males, it's about white males in Europe. So it's a very Eurocentric history. And here you have two examples of this more traditional approach. One is A.B. Thompson, who is kind of father of labor history. For those of you that are more familiar, which wrote one of the most famous books in labor history, which is The Making of the English Working Class. The title says everything. But then in later period, we will see other studies emerging that are at the crossroads between migration history and labor history that will start to look still very Eurocentric, still very male-centric, still very focused on wage earners, but that will start to look at what happens at sea. And here we have, I brought the example of which is the PhD thesis of Jan Lucassen, back from the 1960s, migration labor in Europe, The Drift to the North, which is in fact a book that deals with the maritime labor markets of Northern Europe in the early modern period, and is one of the first books that does that. But it's still very much focused on these core aspects. But this is the first example of cross-fertilization between labor history and maritime labor history. And this will dominate for quite a bit of time. But when we get to the 1990s, under the influence of the theories of the world system theories of Emanuel Wallerstein, I don't know, I think sociologists in the room will recognize this name, and anthropologists. History will become increasingly influenced by his theories, and there is a gradual, and labor history is no exception, maritime history will not be an exception in that, and what we see is a shift from this very Eurocentric kind of approach to a more, an approach that considers other parts of the globe. And when it comes specifically to labor history, what we're going to see is the development of comparative history, but it's still a very limited comparison. So it will be a comparison that will focus mainly between Europe and North America, and the rest of the southern hemisphere will remain to a great extent still ignored in this narrative. It is still very much focused on male wage earners. So it's still a story of wage earners and the struggle for better improvement. But as you can see here in one of these examples I brought here, and these are just examples, there are many other publications that could illustrate this, it's a more inclusive, it starts to be a more inclusive way of looking at labor and at maritime labor in this specific case, because different groups of different ethnic backgrounds will start to be taken into account in these narratives. And this will dominate until we get to the beginning of the 2000s, and of course with globalization and what in history has become the global, known as the global turn, we are going to see major shifts when it comes to the way people look at labor in general, and these will have implications not only broadly, but not only for maritime labor history, but for labor history more broadly. And the institute where I am is in fact one of the institutes that has pushed this agenda of labor history, global labor history forward. So what is this about? Well, basically it's about the inclusion of other regions of the world in a narrative of labor history. So labor history is not just about Europe or about the comparison between Europe and North America, it's also about what's going on in other parts of the world in terms of labor. It's about the inclusion of not just the white wage earner, but it's about the inclusion of people of other ethnic backgrounds, but also people that have worked for no pay, people that have worked under enslaved conditions or forced workers. They have also played a role in the development of the world economy, even though they were not wage earners. So they have also come to be included. The same for women, which have been very much ignored or I wouldn't say ignored, that's maybe a bit too much, but that have been overlooked, and the same as for the role of children and the labor they have performed. And the idea also is not only to include these new actors, but also explore the connections or the interconnections with what happened in different regions and how what happened in different regions with these different groups of actors impacted on other regions. So it's not about comparisons anymore, but it's about looking at interconnections and how these interconnections will have multiplying effects in a local level, regional level, and also at global level. And then also it will be it's a scholarship that is also very much interested in understanding long-term transformation. So how things have changed in the last 500 years. So it's more about also grand narratives. Not to say that micro studies or meso studies are not important, but those are priorities. Here you have 3 examples, and the titles tell you a bit about what is this global narrative. So I brought here just 3 books that illustrate different types of labor. So you have a volume on coerced labor around the world. So it's a book that is an edited volume that just gathers essays and comparative essays on forms of coerced labor across the globe in different time periods and how they are related to each other. You have another one that is more focused on military labor, and again it is a study that examines multiple, the same phenomena on multiple regions under different regimes, so people that have been military paid but also those that have been unpaid. And another example is the Workers of the World, which is in fact a book that reflects on multiple forms of labor relations across the world and that they have developed over time. So how has this I have already gave you a couple of examples of how there has been some cross-fertilization between labor history and maritime labor history. But now let's look more closely at maritime labor history and how labor has a place in the scholarship of maritime labor history. And here again, we can look at maritime history and maritime labor history. We can think of four main phases in terms of the development of the scholarship. There is what I called, and some maritime historians will probably be very upset with me, primordial maritime history, which emerges in the 19th century or even earlier. Then there's the first wave of maritime labor history, a second wave, and there's the most recent labor history, which could be classified global to some extent, but I don't know if I should label like that, so I leave it at this. So what do I call primordial labor history? Primordial maritime history. It's basically the first studies that are carried out that will focus mainly on infrastructure and technology, but above all they will focus on the development of the navies, and they will focus on the big men that play the role in the development of the navy and the development of and play a big role in naval battles and so on. And it's maritime history where, and this is very important, whereas the sea is seen as something that is separate from the land. It's a separate entity. There's no interaction between the sea and the land. And this is something that will change dramatically, or I would say radically, after the publication of this book from Fernando Rodel, which probably many of you have heard, and some of you maybe not, but that's not necessarily a problem, which is a book that will, from this moment on, so we are at 1949, there was a French version, this is the English version that came on later on. This book will change dramatically the perception, because from after this book, no one will see the sea or study the sea without the connection of the sea to the land, and without the connection of the sea to the people. And this is the moment where, the people start to become very important, and the common people, so not the big men, but also the common people will start to be very important in the scholarship of maritime labor history. The first wave of maritime labor history, we could again see here an influence across labor history and maritime history, because this first books that will look in, or studies that will look into maritime labor, they will, like the publications on maritime, on labor history, they will focus very much on wage earners. So it's about the seafarers, it's about especially European seafarers, so it's males, and it's also books that will be very much concerned with shipping and with ships. So this is the kind of the trilogy of maritime history to a certain extent, and it's very much focused on Europe and the North Atlantic. This is something that will gradually change under the influence of on one hand of what is going on in labor history, but also what is going on in the field, especially with the gradual development of Atlantic history. We are going to see an increasing number of studies that will expand the chronological scope. So they will move from focusing mainly on the 19th and 20th century to look backwards. They will also move on from focusing only on Europe and on European seafarers to include a comparison with seafarers in North America. They will move on from only focusing on white seafarers to include other groups of seafarers. You have here another example in this book, Black Salt Seafarers of African Descent on British ships. Which I think is very emblematic, and also another book on dock workers, which is a comparative study across multiple regions. But to a great extent, this narrative is still very much focused on Europe, the Atlantic, and to a great extent still very much focused on discussions of prolocalization. So the improvement of the working conditions of these seafarers. This, of course, will change in the course of time, and when we look at some of the most recent publications, I just brought here 3 examples of books that deal with maritime labor, and others that examine, well, there's one book that looks more into shipping and economic growth, but that also has information on maritime labor. These are publications that have a very different take on maritime labor. So they will, on one hand, include far more regions across the world. So it's not just about Europe or about North America. It's also about what's going on in Africa, what's going on in Asia. And of course, I am more interested in my own work on the Atlantic, but this is something that needs to be acknowledged regardless of that. These are also studies that are far more comparative than other studies, and that are very much interested in exploring connections between these different regions, and include a significant number of more actors than the previous studies have done. An example of that is, for example, the dock workers that have, gained an increasing attention in this historiography, but there's also other groups of workers that work with water that have been increasingly included in this historiography. Did it go? Yeah. So, but there are other subfields within history that have also made a contribution to change the way we look at maritime labor and to change the focus in terms of factors or in terms of questions that we ask on maritime labor history. And I think in this respect, Atlantic history and African history have played an important role, because they have, to a great extent, highlighted very clearly what was the role of the process of empire building, in this case in the Atlantic, and this could be applied also for Asia, I think, to a certain extent, on the circulation of free people, but also on coerced mobility of people. And here we are, between, of course, this is between Europe, Africa, and the Americas, and we have here, but could also be extended to Asia, because there's a lot of Asians coming into the Atlantic. So we have here I listed here 3 main groups. So indentured European workers, enslaved Africans, and indentured workers of Asian origin that are going to come into the Atlantic once the abolition of slavery and of the slave trade takes place at the beginning, in the beginning of the 19th century. But by bringing attention into these groups, they have also started to disclose or show that there is a significant number of individuals involved in maritime or sea-related or water-related activities that are not necessarily only European. So they will give a lot of visibility to maritime workers of African origin or Afro-Caribbean origin, and also of Asian origin, which until some of these studies have been carried out, have been very much neglected and missing from the narrative of labor history. They have also, some of these studies, regardless of not being directly connected to labor, because these are not studies about labor, but about what's going on in the Atlantic, They have also shown that there is a lot of non-wage earners involved in maritime and sea-related activities. Enslaved Africans that were used on board long-distance ships, for example, in their studies of these for the French activities, commercial activities in the Atlantic. Their studies of these, for example, of the Portuguese that have employed enslaved Africans on board the ships that cross the Atlantic. But the same also for coastal trade. So the importance of the skill of African workers that are specialized on coastal trade, on the coast of Africa itself, or on river trade, and their skills become essential for the Europeans to operate their transcontinental trade. These scholars were not interested necessarily on labor, but their research has unveiled these activities and the role played by these groups of workers. And what these two subfields of history also have highlighted, among other things, but that contribute to shifts in maritime labor history, is the transfer of sea knowledge between different regions of the Atlantic, not necessarily by Europeans, which is a narrative that has dominated for a very long time, but also by other groups of historical actors, including enslaved Africans that have transferred a lot of information from one side of the Atlantic to the other side of the Atlantic, and will continue transferring that knowledge across generations. Here, a couple of examples of what I am talking about. So this is just, a list of, I could pick other books, but this is just a sample to give you an idea. I picked The Slave Ship, A Human History from Marcus Redica, where he clearly shows the human dimension within the slave ship, but also the tasks that are, what happens within the slave ship, who is there, what is the role of the Africans there. You will have Africans that are enslaved, that are transported, but you also have Africans that will be in charge of controlling the groups of enslaved that are transported. So it gives a different dimension to our understanding of maritime labor. You have, for example, two books on African history or West African history with a social history of West Africa by Robin Law, and another book on Afro-European trade in the Atlantic world by Silk Strickhoff. And both of these books are on African history, but they do reveal the importance of African sailors and African coastal traders in the development of the European operations in the Atlantic. And by doing that, they reveal us a lot about maritime labor on the coast and what's going on there, and which was something that we were less knowledgeable about. And then finally I brought this book, which is more recent, called Undercurrents of Power, Aquatic Culture in the African Diaspora, which is exactly about the point I was talking about, in the last point I was talking about, this transfer of knowledge from aquatic knowledge from the west coast of Africa to the Caribbean, in this specific case, by enslaved Africans and then transferred across generations there. So you can see that, just by looking at these four main subfields of history, that has been a huge transformation on the way. Over the last 8 years, we have looked at maritime labor, but in my opinion, there's still a lot to be done. And now, in the last slides and minutes, I will just talk about that very briefly. And there's other points that will be open for discussion. So there's a couple of, I think, still missing actors in this narrative of maritime labor. And above all, I think what's still very much missing is the people on land that are connected to the sea. And so the man on the coast, and I will give you here examples from African history, which is what I'm most familiar with. So for example, in Dutch sources, but also in Portuguese sources, there's a lot of references to men that are called bombas and remadores and groomets, which are in fact African men, some of them enslaved, others freed, that work on the shore. They will be responsible for doing coastal trade, for connection, for navigation in the rivers. They still very much absent from this narrative. So it's something that needs to be, in my opinion, further explored, and I hope that someone will pick up on this. Then there's fishing communities that our colleague yesterday was talking about, and we know a lot about them for the 20th century, we know quite a bit about them for the 19th century, but we know very little about the early modern period. I mean, here in the north of Portugal is an exception, because there has been a lot of studies carried out that focus on port cities and fishing communities. But what about fishing communities in Brazil, for example, in the early modern period? We don't know anything about that. The same would go for Africa. We also don't know. And there was fishing communities in these areas. Because if we look at the images, I mean, this is an image of Elmina in the 17th century. You can see there's the fort, the European fort. But you also see there's a village. There's a lot of canoes. If you go to Elmina nowadays, I could show you a picture. These canoes are there. And what these people are doing is they are fishing. But we don't know anything about the fishing community there. What we know about is the narrative of the slave trade, which is important, but still we don't know anything about that. So they should be added. And the same goes for the women and for the children, because if you go to Elmina today, you will see a lot of women on the shore involved in these fishing activities. They will be the ones that very often sell the fish, but we don't know anything about them. And the same for the children that hang around the beach, and they will be engaging in all kinds of activities. We also remain knowing very little about the relationship between the workers that are on board the ships, on the coastal ships or on the long distance ships, that are in different situations of employment, so in different relationship with the master of the ship. So people that are wage earners, people that are enslaved, those that are not paid, those that are convicts, those that are forced workers. We don't know how they relate. There is this romantic idea that our colleague was talking about earlier this morning, that there is some solidarity between them. That is suggested in some history books, but in fact, apparently not. But we still know too little about that to say something very specific, so more research is needed. And a last point that I would like to raise here today, and I will finish this is my last slide, so I'll shut up, I will go on. Okay. Is we talk about, labor and maritime labor, and this is a recurrent thing, but we know very little about labor recruitment. Who gained from labor recruitment? Being free labor, unfree labor, who gained from this? How it was organized? What was the relationship between the hinterland, the port, and the sea when it comes to recruitment of labor, consumption of labor? Because that's what in the end is about. We know a bit about the Americas because we know all these enslaved Africans were transferred to the Americas, they entered to the port, and they were distributed to the hinterland. For that there is a significant literature. There's also quite a bit of literature for what happens in Africa. But all the rest remains very blurred. So that's something that, in my opinion, should be looked into. Another thing is the role of the hinterland or the hinterlands in these different locations across the Atlantic as consumer of labor. And for the Americas we have some information, but for other parts we know very little. We know a bit about, for example, the recruitment of soldiers for the Dutch West India Company or for the Dutch East India Company, but we know very little about the recruitment patterns here in Portugal. How did they, gather labor to go on the fleets? We know a bit about impressment in the case of England, but we still know very little. And we don't also know who gained from this. Because people in many cases have to pay for lodging, they have to be brought from interior areas. That's something that we know very little, and that I think, well, future generations of maritime historians or non-maritime historians should pay attention to. And I will leave it at that. Thank you very much.